The hidden architect. What if everything you thought you knew about ancient history was missing a crucial piece? We're not talking about the flashy kings and epic battles that grab the headlines in your history textbooks. No, mate. We're diving into something far more intriguing, the hidden catalysts that truly ignited the world's most powerful empires, the secret pathways to dominance that most folks never even think about. For centuries, we've been told the story of empire through the lens of great men and dramatic moments. Alexander's conquests, Caesar's ambition, the fall of Constantinople. These make for cracking good stories, don't they? But they're missing the point entirely. The real architects of empire weren't the ones wearing crowns or leading cavalry charges. They were the engineers diverting rivers, the clerks developing writing systems, the traders establishing routes that would reshape the world. They were the unsung innovators whose quiet revolutions made the grand conquests possible in the first place. We're about to uncover the real story behind humanity's greatest empires, and it's nothing like what you've been told. This is the story of the hidden architects who built the foundations of our world, echoes of empire, legacy and lesson. Here's the thing that'll absolutely blow your mind. These ancient empires didn't just vanish into thin air when they collapsed. Their influence spread like ripples across time and space, shaping civilizations that never even knew they existed. We're talking about a kind of cultural DNA that gets passed down through generations, across continents, through trade routes and refugee migrations, and the simple human tendency to copy what works. Take irrigation, for instance. A farmer in ancient China develops a clever new technique for channeling water to his rice paddies. Nothing earth-shattering, just a practical solution to a local problem. But traders see it, travelers talk about it, and slowly, sometimes over centuries, that innovation makes its way along the Silk Road, gets adapted by Persian engineers, refined by Arab scholars, and eventually transforms agriculture across 3 continents. Fast forward a few hundred years and you've got sophisticated irrigation systems revolutionizing agriculture in places like Al-Andalus and the Nile Delta. Not because some emperor decreed it from on high, but because good ideas have this remarkable habit of spreading. They adapt, they evolve, they survive long after the civilization that created them has turned to dust. The Romans perfected concrete, and I mean properly perfected it. Their formula was so bloody good that some Roman structures are still standing today, 2,000 years later, while modern buildings start crumbling after a few decades. We're still trying to reverse engineer their techniques, still using variations of their formulas in contemporary construction. Every time you drive over a bridge or walk into a skyscraper, you're benefiting from Roman engineering genius. The Persians created the first proper postal system, the Angarium, with relay stations, fresh horses, and professional riders who could get a message from one end of the empire to the other faster than anyone thought possible. Sound familiar? That's the backbone of every modern communication network, from the Pony Express to FedEx to the internet infrastructure that delivered this very documentary to your screen. But here's where it gets properly interesting and where most historians get it completely wrong. We've got this obsession with the dramatic moments, the burning of Rome, the sack of Baghdad, the fall of Constantinople. Hollywood loves that stuff, doesn't it? Armies clashing, cities burning, empires collapsing in a blaze of glory. But the real story of imperial collapse is far more subtle and, frankly, far more terrifying. It's not about barbarians at the gates or sudden military defeats. It's about slow strangulation, economic strain that builds over decades as the cost of maintaining vast territories outweighs their benefits. Administrative bloat that gradually strangles efficiency as bureaucracies grow fat and corrupt. Environmental changes that shift the balance of power so gradually that no one notices until it's too late. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall in a day. It spent centuries bleeding out, tax revenues declining as trade routes shifted, military expenses skyrocketing as threats multiplied, administrative systems growing so complex that they consumed more resources than they produced. Climate change? Yes, climate change in the 5th century, disrupting agriculture and forcing massive population movements. These aren't the sexy stories that make it into the blockbusters, but they're the real killers of empires, and they're happening again, right now, in our modern world. The parallels are frankly chilling if you know what to look for. The Byzantine Empire lasted over 1,000 years after Rome fell, not through military might, but through administrative genius. They perfected the art of bureaucracy, created the world's first comprehensive legal code since Rome, and developed economic systems so sophisticated that medieval Europe couldn't match them for centuries. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, it wasn't because the Byzantines had forgotten how to fight, it was because they'd been gradually outmaneuvered economically and technologically. And what does all this teach us about the human condition? That our drive for power, progress, and dominance runs deeper than individual ambition. It's baked into the very fabric of how we organize ourselves as a species. It's not just about one group conquering another. It's about the intricate, often invisible mechanisms that allow some societies to flourish while others stagnate. The most successful civilizations weren't necessarily the most warlike, they were the most adaptive. They were the ones that could absorb new ideas, integrate conquered peoples, and evolve their systems to meet changing circumstances. They understood something fundamental. Empires aren't built on force alone. They're built on systems that outlast any individual ruler, any single generation, any particular crisis. The dawn of dominance, unexpected beginnings. Let's wind the clock back, way back. We're talking roughly 12,000 years ago, give or take a millennium. Picture this. Our ancestors are still living in small, nomadic groups following herds and seasons, with no permanent settlements and certainly no grand plans of world domination. The global population is maybe 5 million people, scattered across vast continents, living pretty much the same way their great-great-grandparents had lived for thousands of generations. Then something shifts. And this is crucial. It's not a dramatic, overnight change. We're talking about tiny, almost imperceptible alterations in temperature and rainfall patterns. The last ice age is ending, but it's not ending uniformly. Some regions are getting warmer and wetter, others cooler and drier. Glaciers are retreating in some areas while expanding in others. Climate shifts so subtle that the people living through them probably didn't even notice from year to year. But these micro-changes triggered something absolutely massive, what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, though revolution makes it sound far more dramatic than it actually was. This was more like a very slow-motion transformation that took place over several thousand years. In a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, basically modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and bits of Turkey and Iran. Those wild grains that had been growing scattered across the landscape began thriving in more concentrated areas. Wild emmer wheat, einkorn, barley. These became the world's first superfoods, though it would be millennia before anyone thought to post about them on social media. But here's what's absolutely fascinating. Our ancestors didn't set out to invent agriculture. They stumbled into it through a combination of environmental pressure and brilliant improvisation. As the climate shifted, some of their traditional food sources became less reliable, so they started paying more attention to these wild grains, learning their patterns, maybe giving them a bit of help by clearing competing plants or directing water their way. The breakthrough moment came when someone, and we'll never know who, figured out that you could plant these seeds deliberately, that you could save the biggest, best grains from each harvest and use them to grow even better crops the next year. Selective breeding, though they wouldn't have called it that. Pure genius disguised as common sense. And it wasn't just about the plants. Our ancestors got absolutely brilliant about animal domestication too. This wasn't just a matter of taming wild beasts. It was about fundamentally reimagining the relationship between humans and animals. Sheep, cattle, pigs, goats. They weren't just mobile meat lockers anymore. They became living factories. Sheep produced wool that could be spun into textiles far superior to anything made from plant fibers. Cattle provided milk, leather, and muscle power that could transform landscapes. Pigs turned scraps and waste into protein. Goats could thrive in marginal lands and provide milk, meat, and hide. These animals became partners in a new kind of economic system. But the real game changer was the horse. When humans figured out how to ride and harness horses, probably around 4000 BCE, on the steppes of Central Asia, they didn't just gain a new form of transportation, they gained speed, range, and military advantage that would reshape the balance of power across continents. The civilizations that mastered horse culture, the Mongols, the Arabs, the various nomadic peoples, would repeatedly humble their sedentary neighbors. Now, none of this was part of some grand master plan. It was necessity driving innovation, one small step at a time. But the cumulative result was staggering. For the first time in human history, people could stay put. They could accumulate surplus food, which meant they could support specialists, craftsmen, priests, administrators, soldiers, who didn't spend their days finding food. Settlements formed first as seasonal camps, then as permanent villages, eventually as towns and cities. Population density skyrocketed. In regions where hunting and gathering might have supported one person per square mile, agriculture could support 50, 100, sometimes more. The mathematics of power had fundamentally shifted. And this is where it gets really interesting. Those tribal networks that seemed so insignificant at the time, the little squabbles over water rights, the seasonal trading partnerships between groups, the marriage alliances between clans, they were laying the groundwork for something massive. These weren't random conflicts or arbitrary agreements. They were humanity's first experiments in large-scale organization. Every peace treaty was a lesson in diplomacy. Every trade agreement was practice in economic cooperation. Every territorial dispute was training in the complex art of managing competing interests across different groups. The Natufians in the Levant developed the first permanent settlements around 12,000 years ago, but they still relied primarily on hunting and gathering. It took them another 2,000 years to fully transition to agriculture. The Mesopotamians were building cities by 3500 BCE, but they were still working out the basics of urban planning, sanitation, and civil administration. Each generation built on the innovations of the previous one, slowly developing the tools and techniques that would eventually make empire possible. Pottery for storage, metalworking for tools and weapons, writing systems for record keeping, mathematical concepts for engineering and commerce. The stage was being set piece by piece, innovation by innovation. The players were in position, though they didn't know they were players in anything larger than their immediate concerns. The age of empires was still thousands of years away, but its foundations were being laid by people who just wanted to solve the practical problems of daily life. And that's the key insight. Empires weren't built by visionaries dreaming of world conquest. They were built by practical people solving immediate problems, whose solutions happened to be scalable, adaptable, and ultimately revolutionary.
Seeds of power. Innovation beyond invention. Right, now we're getting to the meat of it. Here's where things get properly fascinating, and where most people get the story completely wrong. You might think empires were built on military might. All bronze swords and iron spears and cavalry charges thundering across battlefields. Classic Hollywood stuff, isn't it? But the real power, the foundation that everything else rested on, was flowing through channels that most people never even saw. And the most crucial of these was water. Not just access to water, that's obvious, but the ability to control, direct, and manipulate water on a massive scale. See, controlling water meant controlling life itself. And the civilizations that crack the code on advanced water management, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the folks in the Indus Valley, the early Chinese dynasties, they didn't just feed their people better, they created massive resource disparities that would determine the course of history for millennia. Think about it this way. If your civilization can support 10 times the population density of your neighbors, who's going to come out on top in the long run? It's not even about military superiority at that point. It's simple demographics. More people means more soldiers, more workers, more innovators, more tax revenue, more everything. The Mesopotamians were the absolute masters of this game. They turned the chaos of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into the world's most productive agricultural system through sheer engineering brilliance. We're talking about canal networks that stretched for hundreds of miles, sophisticated locks and dams, drainage systems that prevented salinization, technology so advanced that some of it wasn't matched again until the 19th century. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about irrigation. It was about power in the most literal sense. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything downstream. They could reward allies with reliable flooding and punish enemies with drought. They could support massive urban populations while their neighbors remained scattered in small villages. The Egyptians took a different approach but achieved similar results. They didn't fight the Nile's annual floods. They learned to work with them, developing incredibly sophisticated systems for measuring, predicting, and managing the river's cycles. Their nilometers weren't just measuring tools. They were early warning systems that allowed them to prepare for feast or famine years in advance. And the scale of these projects? Absolutely mind-boggling. The Grand Canal in China, begun over 2,500 years ago, stretches for more than 1,100 miles and required the coordinated labor of millions of workers over several centuries. It connected the agricultural heartland in the south with the political centers in the north, making possible a level of economic integration that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. But water management was just the beginning. The real genius move, the innovation that made everything else possible, was the rise of what we might call proto-bureaucracies. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bureaucracy sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry. But these early administrative systems were absolutely revolutionary. Imagine trying to run an empire without knowing how much grain you've got in storage, which regions have paid their taxes, where your troops are stationed, or what your trading partners owe you. Impossible, right? But that's exactly the challenge facing the world's first large-scale societies. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia figured out cuneiform writing not primarily to record epic poems or religious texts, though they did that too, but to track every sheep, every bushel of barley, every silver coin flowing through their territory. These weren't just pretty symbols carved in clay. They were the world's first database management system. And the level of detail was extraordinary. Sumerian administrators tracked not just quantities, but qualities. They had different symbols for different types of barley, different grades of wool, different alloys of bronze. They recorded not just who owed what to whom, but when debts were incurred, what interest rates applied, and what happened if someone defaulted. Inventory management might not sound sexy, but it was the backbone of imperial power. You can't control what you can't measure, and these early administrators became absolute masters of measurement. They developed standardized weights and measures, unified currencies, and accounting systems that allowed them to manage resources across vast territories. The Egyptians took this even further, developing what was probably the world's first centralized bureaucracy. Every aspect of life in ancient Egypt was recorded, tracked, and managed by professional scribes who formed a distinct social class. They had detailed records of land ownership, tax obligations, military service, and even individual workers' productivity on major construction projects. But perhaps the most sophisticated administrative system was developed by the Persians. When Cyrus the Great and his successors built their empire, they inherited dozens of different legal systems, currencies, languages, and administrative traditions. Rather than trying to impose uniformity everywhere, which would have been impossible, they created a flexible, adaptive system that could work with local variations while maintaining central control. Persian satrapies were like franchises. They had to meet certain standards and deliver specified results, but they had considerable autonomy in how they achieved those goals. This wasn't just pragmatic politics. It was organizational genius that allowed the Persian Empire to become the largest the world had yet seen. And then there's the monuments, the pyramids, the ziggurats, the massive stone circles that dot landscapes across the world. We tend to see these as religious or ceremonial structures, and certainly they had spiritual significance. But strip away the mysticism, and what do you see? Psychological warfare, mate. Pure and simple. These weren't just buildings. They were statements of power that could be read from miles away. They said, look what we can achieve. Look at the resources we command. Look at the thousands of workers who follow our orders. Look at our ability to organize, plan, and execute projects that will outlast generations. But they were also something else. They were technologies for creating social cohesion. Think about what it takes to build a pyramid. You need thousands of workers coordinated over decades, all pulling in the same direction. You need logistic systems to feed and house them. You need engineering expertise to solve unprecedented technical challenges. You need administrative systems to organize the whole operation. The ancient world didn't have mass media, but they had mass monuments. And, bloody hell, did they work. These structures created shared identity, demonstrated collective capability, and established psychological dominance that lasted for centuries. When Alexander's troops first saw the walls of Babylon, they were looking at technology designed to make them feel small and insignificant before they ever drew a sword. The Chinese perfected this concept with the Great Wall, which served multiple functions simultaneously. Yes, it was a military fortification, but it was also a massive public works project that employed hundreds of thousands of workers, a symbol of imperial power that could be seen from space, and a psychological barrier that defined Chinese civilization against the barbarian world beyond. These innovations, water management, administrative systems, monumental architecture, they weren't separate developments. They were interconnected technologies that reinforced each other and made possible something unprecedented in human history: the ability to organize and control millions of people across vast territories for extended periods of time. And here's the thing that really gets me. Most of these innovations were developed not by the famous kings and conquerors, but by anonymous engineers, scribes, and administrators whose names are lost to history. They were solving practical problems, day by day, innovation by innovation, building the systems that would eventually make empire possible. The unseen architects. Behind the grandeur, behind every great empire, there's an army of people you've never heard of. Brilliant individuals whose innovations made the grand conquests possible, but who rarely get mentioned in the history books. These are the unsung heroes who kept the whole show running while the emperors got all the credit and the glory. Let's start with the traders, because these folks were the original globalists, and I mean that in the best possible way. We're not talking about local merchants hawking their wares at the village market on Saturday mornings. These were sophisticated international businessmen running trade networks that spanned continents and connected civilizations that didn't even know each other existed. Picture this. Silk produced by Chinese artisans ends up woven into togas worn by Roman senators. Spices grown in the mountains of Kerala flavor stews in Germanic longhouses. Gold mined in West Africa funds construction projects in Baghdad. Amber from the Baltic shores becomes jewelry worn by Mesopotamian nobility. These weren't isolated transactions. They were part of vast, complex networks that required incredible organizational sophistication. The scale is what really gets you. We're talking about trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles, crossing deserts, mountains, and oceans. The Silk Road wasn't actually a single road. It was a web of interconnected routes that required coordination between dozens of different political entities, each with their own laws, currencies, and customs. And the logistics? Mind-boggling. A merchant caravan traveling from Chang'an to Constantinople would need supplies, protection, and local guides for a journey that could take 2 years. They'd need to know seasonal weather patterns, political conditions, exchange rates, and local regulations in dozens of different territories. They were the original international logistics experts. But it wasn't just about moving goods. These traders were moving information. They were the Internet of the ancient world, carrying news, technologies, ideas, and innovations along with their merchandise. A mathematical concept developed in India would travel with Muslim merchants to Baghdad, get refined by Islamic scholars, then make its way to Cordoba and eventually to medieval European universities. The Phoenicians were perhaps the masters of this game. Operating from their base cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast, they established trading posts and colonies from Spain to North Africa to the Black Sea. They weren't interested in territorial conquest in the traditional sense. They wanted commercial networks, and they got them, creating what was essentially the world's first multinational corporation. Their innovations in navigation, shipbuilding, and commercial law influenced civilizations for centuries. The alphabet you're reading right now? That comes from Phoenician merchants who needed a simple, efficient writing system for keeping commercial records. They took the complex hieroglyphic and cuneiform systems and streamlined them into something any trader could learn quickly. But managing all this complexity required some seriously clever administrative minds back home. These were the world's first systems analysts, and they were dealing with problems that would challenge modern corporations. How do you maintain quality control across a supply chain that spans 3 continents? How do you manage currency exchanges when every city-state has its own money? How do you resolve disputes between merchants who speak different languages and follow different laws? The solution was standardization, creating common measures, weights, and procedures that could work anywhere in the network. A pound of grain in Alexandria had to mean the same thing as a pound of grain in Damascus. A silver coin minted in Athens had to be accepted at face value in Tyre. These weren't just technical standards. They were the foundations of international commerce. The Persians perfected this concept with their road system, which wasn't just about moving armies, it was about moving information and commerce. The Royal Road stretched for over 1,600 miles from Sardis to Susa, with relay stations every 14 miles where fresh horses and riders were waiting. A message that would take a normal traveler 3 months to deliver could be carried by the Persian postal system in just over a week. Neither snow nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. That is not about your local postman. That's a description of the Persian postal service written by Herodotus, and it was so efficient it put modern delivery services to shame. But the really sophisticated stuff was happening in the administrative centers, where armies of clerks and accountants were developing the systems that made imperial governance possible. These folks were inventing concepts we still use today: double-entry bookkeeping, standardized contracts, insurance policies, credit systems. The Mesopotamians developed what was probably the world's first banking system, with institutions that could transfer funds between cities, provide loans for commercial ventures, and manage complex international transactions. The business records from ancient Babylon read like modern corporate documents: letters of credit, partnership agreements, insurance contracts, bankruptcy proceedings. And perhaps the most overlooked innovation was law itself. Not the grand proclamations and divine commandments that get all the attention, but the nitty-gritty legal codes that kept complex societies from falling apart. Hammurabi's code gets the headlines because of an eye for an eye, But the real genius was in the hundreds of specific regulations covering everything from property disputes to business partnerships to agricultural contracts. These laws didn't just punish bad behavior, they created the predictable legal framework that made sophisticated economic activity possible. When merchants knew their contracts would be enforced, they could make long-term investments. When property rights were secure, people could develop land and build businesses. When disputes could be resolved through legal proceedings rather than violence, commerce could flourish. The Roman legal system took this concept and perfected it, creating a comprehensive framework that could work across different cultures and territories. Roman law wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about creating the conditions for prosperity. Their concepts of contract law, property rights, and corporate entities still form the backbone of modern legal systems. But perhaps the most impressive administrative achievement was the Chinese imperial examination system, which created what was probably the world's first meritocratic bureaucracy. Rather than relying on aristocratic birth or military achievement, the Chinese developed a system for identifying and training talented administrators, regardless of their social background. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about efficiency. By recruiting the most capable people into government service, the Chinese created an administrative system that could function effectively across a territory larger than the entire Roman Empire. The examination system produced generations of highly educated, professionally competent officials who could manage everything from tax collection to flood control to military logistics. When people knew the rules, they could plan ahead. When they could plan, they could invest in the future. When they invested, civilizations flourished. It really is that simple and that revolutionary. These anonymous administrators, traders, engineers, and legal scholars created the foundations that made empire possible. They weren't trying to conquer the world, they were trying to solve practical problems. But their solutions happened to be scalable, adaptable, and ultimately transformative. They built the systems that outlasted any individual emperor, any single dynasty, any particular crisis. The first kings, charisma, cults, and conquest. So how does a regular bloke, probably someone who started out as just another tribal chief worried about crop yields and cattle raids, end up ruling over millions of people as a god king? It's one hell of a career progression when you think about it, and it didn't happen overnight. The psychological evolution from tribal leader to divine ruler wasn't some random historical accident. It was a carefully crafted process that took centuries to perfect. And the really interesting bit is that it happened independently in multiple places around the world, which suggests there's something fundamental about human nature that makes this transformation possible. These early leaders understood something crucial about how people think and behave. We don't just follow strength, we follow stories. Raw power might get you compliance, but stories get you genuine loyalty. And loyalty, not fear, is what allows you to build something that lasts. Think about the difference. A tribal chief might control his village through personal charisma and the occasional show of force. He knows everyone personally, settles disputes face to face, and leads by example. But an emperor, he's ruling over millions of people he'll never meet, most of whom have never seen him and never will. How do you create loyalty among people who know you only as an abstraction? The answer is narrative. You don't just rule. You embody a story that gives meaning to people's lives. You're not just a political leader. You're the chosen representative of the gods, the protector of cosmic order, the living embodiment of everything that makes your civilization special. The Egyptians were absolute masters of this game. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was literally a god walking among mortals, the son of Ra, the guarantor that the Nile would flood and the sun would rise. When ordinary Egyptians bowed before the pharaoh, they weren't just showing political submission. They were participating in a cosmic drama that had been playing out since the beginning of time. And this wasn't just propaganda. It was sophisticated political psychology. By making the ruler divine, you solve several problems at once. You make rebellion not just treason, but sacrilege. You create a unifying symbol that transcends local loyalties and tribal divisions, and you establish a system of authority that doesn't depend on the personal qualities of any individual ruler. But here's where it gets really clever. The most successful early empires didn't just impose their royal cult from above, they integrated it with existing belief systems. When the Persians conquered new territories, they didn't destroy local gods. They declared that Cyrus was chosen by those gods too. When Alexander conquered Egypt, he didn't replace Egyptian religion. He became pharaoh and added himself to the Egyptian pantheon. This wasn't just religious tolerance, it was strategic genius. By incorporating local beliefs into imperial ideology, these rulers made conquest feel less like foreign domination and more like cosmic destiny. They weren't destroying people's worlds, they were completing them. The Romans took this concept and systematized it in ways that were frankly brilliant. The imperial cult wasn't just about worshiping the emperor, it was about worshiping the idea of Rome itself. Roman citizenship became a kind of secular religion, complete with rituals, symbols, and shared narratives that could unite people from Britain to Syria. But the psychological transformation wasn't just about the rulers. It was about the subjects, too. Early empires had to solve a fundamental problem. How do you get people to accept being ruled by strangers? Hunter-gatherer societies are remarkably egalitarian. Even early agricultural communities tend to be fairly democratic in their decision-making. So how do you convince free people to bow down before a king? The answer involves what psychologists now call social proof, the tendency to look to others for cues about appropriate behavior. If everyone around you is treating someone like a god-king, it becomes psychologically difficult to maintain that they're just another human being. The rituals, the ceremonies, the elaborate court protocols, they're not just pageantry. They're technologies for reshaping human psychology on a mass scale, and this is where early religious cults became absolutely crucial to imperial success. We're not talking about the fire and brimstone stuff you might imagine. We're talking about shared belief systems that gave diverse groups a common identity and purpose. Consider the challenge. You're trying to unite farmers from the river valleys, herders from the mountains, fishermen from the coast, and traders from the cities. They speak different dialects, follow different customs, worship different gods. What could possibly make them feel like they're all part of the same people? You need a story bigger than local loyalties, a narrative that makes everyone feel like they're participants in some grander cosmic plan. The Mesopotamians developed elaborate mythologies that explained not just their own origins, but the structure of reality itself. The Egyptians created a religious system so compelling that it influenced neighboring civilizations for thousands of years. But the real genius was in the rituals, the shared practices that made abstract beliefs concrete and personal. When people from different backgrounds participated in the same ceremonies, sang the same hymns, followed the same calendar of festivals, they began to feel like members of the same community. Religion became a technology for creating social cohesion on a scale never before achieved in human history. The Chinese perfected this concept with the mandate of heaven, which was probably the most sophisticated political theology ever developed. The emperor didn't just rule by divine right, he ruled by divine performance. If he governed well, maintained social harmony, and ensured prosperity, then heaven supported his reign. But if things went badly, if there were natural disasters, military defeats, or social upheaval, that was evidence that heaven had withdrawn its support and someone else should rule. This system was psychologically brilliant because it made imperial authority both absolute and conditional. The emperor was the son of heaven, deserving complete obedience, but only as long as he was doing his job properly. It legitimized imperial power while also providing a framework for legitimate resistance if that power was abused. But belief systems and royal cults could only take you so far. At some point, empires had to back up their claims with force, and this is where we see another crucial innovation: the evolution from chaotic tribal warfare to sophisticated military science. Gone were the days of disorganized raids and blood feuds between neighboring clans. The first emperors developed coordinated campaigns, professional armies, standardized equipment, and tactical innovations that turned warfare from a brutal scramble into a strategic art. The Assyrians were probably the first to really master this transformation. They created what was essentially the world's first modern military. Professional soldiers who trained full-time, standardized weapons and equipment, sophisticated logistic systems, and tactical doctrines that could be applied consistently across different theaters of operation. But the real innovation wasn't just military. It was administrative. How do you supply an army of 50,000 soldiers on campaign for months at a time? How do you coordinate multiple columns advancing along different routes? How do you maintain discipline and morale among troops drawn from different ethnic backgrounds who may not even speak the same language? The solutions required bureaucratic innovations that were just as sophisticated as anything happening in civilian administration. Military engineering, siege warfare, naval operations. These became specialized fields requiring years of training and professional expertise. And the most successful early empires realized something crucial. The goal wasn't just to win battles, it was to win them so decisively that future resistance became unthinkable. Assyrian siege techniques were so advanced and so terrifying that many cities surrendered rather than face the consequences of resistance. Roman legions were so disciplined and so effective that they became the gold standard for military organization for over 1,000 years. But here's the really sophisticated part. The most successful imperial armies weren't just conquest machines. They were integration systems. Roman legions didn't just conquer territories. They built roads, established cities, and created the infrastructure that made imperial governance possible. They turned conquest into colonization, and colonization into civilization. The end result was that the most successful early empires did not just conquer their enemies. They convinced them to become willing participants in an even grander project. They offered not just submission, but membership, not just defeat, but opportunity, not just conquest, but transformation. And that, ultimately, is how a tribal chief becomes a god-king ruling over millions. Not through force alone, but through the sophisticated combination of narrative, ritual, administration, and military power that could transform human societies on an unprecedented scale. The lasting transformation. The transformation from tribal societies to imperial civilizations represents one of the most dramatic changes in human history, and its effects are still shaping our world today. What we're really talking about is the invention of complex society itself, the ability to organize millions of people in coordinated action across vast territories for extended periods of time. Before the rise of empires, human societies were limited by what anthropologists call Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit to the number of stable social relationships an individual can maintain, which is roughly 150 people. Beyond that number, personal relationships break down and societies fragment. But empires found ways to transcend this biological limitation through institutional innovation. They created impersonal systems of authority that didn't depend on face-to-face relationships. They developed technologies for managing information across vast distances and timescales. They invented legal and economic frameworks that could coordinate the behavior of strangers who would never meet. In effect, they created artificial extensions of human cognitive capacity that allowed societies to grow far beyond their natural limits. And the really remarkable thing is how durable these innovations have proven to be. The bureaucratic systems developed by ancient empires are still the backbone of modern government. The legal concepts pioneered by Roman jurists still form the foundation of international law. The economic techniques perfected by Mesopotamian merchants are still used in global commerce. But perhaps most importantly, empires established the principle that human societies could be consciously designed and deliberately improved. Before empires, social organization evolved slowly through trial and error over many generations. But imperial administrators began to think systematically about how societies function and how they might be made to function better. This was the beginning of what we might call social engineering. The idea that human communities are not just natural phenomena, but artificial systems that can be analyzed, modified, and optimized. It's a concept that has had profound implications for everything from urban planning to economic policy to political reform. Conclusion. So, there you have it, the hidden architects of human civilization. Not the kings and generals whose names echo through history books and Hollywood movies, but the innovators, administrators, engineers, and visionaries who built the systems that made empires possible in the first place. The next time you turn on a tap and clean water flows out, remember the ancient engineers who first figured out how to move water across vast distances and distribute it efficiently to urban populations. When you check your bank balance online, tip your hat to the Mesopotamian accountants who invented double-entry bookkeeping and the concept of standardized currency. When you follow GPS directions to navigate across a city, think about the Persian postal riders who first mapped efficient routes across continents and established the relay systems that made long-distance communication possible. When you visit a government office and marvel at, or complain about, bureaucratic procedures, remember that you're experiencing the legacy of Sumerian administrators who first figured out how to manage complex societies through systematic record-keeping and standardized procedures. When you sign a contract or make a legal agreement, you're using concepts that were pioneered by ancient legal scholars who created the frameworks that make complex commerce and cooperation possible. These weren't accidents of history. They were solutions to fundamental human challenges that remain relevant today. How do you organize large groups of people without descending into chaos? How do you manage scarce resources across vast distances and competing interests? How do you create institutions that can outlast any individual leader and adapt to changing circumstances? How do you build systems that serve human flourishing rather than just concentrating power? The answers to these questions built empires, and they built our modern world. The principles underlying ancient irrigation systems inform contemporary infrastructure projects. The administrative techniques developed by imperial bureaucrats influence modern organizational management. The legal concepts pioneered by ancient lawmakers shape contemporary international relations. But understanding these connections isn't just about appreciating historical continuity. It's about learning from both the successes and failures of our predecessors. Ancient empires achieved remarkable things, but they also made costly mistakes that we can study and hopefully avoid. They showed us how to coordinate large-scale human cooperation, but they often did so at the cost of individual freedom and local autonomy. They demonstrated how to accumulate and distribute resources efficiently, but they frequently created systems of inequality that ultimately undermined their own stability. They proved that human societies could consciously evolve and improve, but they also showed how quickly sophisticated systems could collapse when they became rigid, corrupt, or disconnected from the needs of ordinary people. The challenges we face in the 21st century, managing global resources sustainably, coordinating international cooperation, creating institutions that serve human flourishing rather than just concentrating power, these are fundamentally the same challenges our ancestors faced when they were building the first empires. The scale is different, the technology is different, but the underlying human dynamics remain remarkably similar. We're still trying to figure out how to organize complex societies fairly and efficiently. We're still struggling with questions about how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. We're still learning how to create institutions that can adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential purpose. Perhaps it's time we learned more deliberately from the real architects of the ancient world, not the famous conquerors who claimed the credit, but the anonymous innovators who did the actual work of building civilizations that could endure. They were not trying to dominate the world. They were trying to solve practical problems and create better lives for their communities. But their solutions happened to be scalable, adaptable, and ultimately transformational. The hidden architects of empire weren't just building for their own time. They were building the foundations for everything that came after, including the world we inhabit today. Understanding their innovations, their methods, and their mistakes might just be the key to building the kind of future we actually want to live in. Because here's the final insight. Empires weren't built by destiny or divine will or the inevitable march of progress. They were built by human beings using human ingenuity to solve human problems. And if they could figure out how to organize millions of people in coordinated action using nothing but bronze tools and clay tablets, imagine what we might accomplish with the technologies and understanding available to us today. The age of empires is over, but the age of complex human cooperation is just beginning. And the lessons learned by our ancient architects about systems thinking, institutional design, and the delicate art of balancing competing human needs have never been more relevant than they are right now.